Have you ever wondered what secrets a millionaire hides behind a bouquet of roses? A little girl asked a millionaire why he sat alone with roses, and his heartbreaking answer changed her forever. Lily had always liked walking home by herself when the weather was warm. She liked the way the late afternoon sunlight fell across the sidewalks, turning the pavement almost golden, and how the breeze carried the smell of cut grass from someone's yard. Usually, her walk was short, just a few blocks from her school to the little house she shared with her mother. But that day, she was moving more slowly, as if something in the air had asked her to pay attention. She couldn't have explained why she stopped at the bus stop halfway home. Maybe it was because she noticed the bright red roses first, a whole bouquet of them clutched tightly in the hands of a man who looked as though he hadn't moved for a very long time. He was sitting on the narrow metal bench, leaning forward a little with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the ground. Even from a distance, she could tell he was sad in a way that felt too big to hide. Lily felt her heart give a small ache, the kind she sometimes felt when she saw a hurt animal or when her mother looked tired after working late. Wait, could this moment change both their lives forever? She had never seen a grown-up look so alone, and something inside her insisted she couldn't keep walking past. She came a few steps closer, close enough to see that his suit was very clean and neat. The deep blue fabric too nice for an ordinary day. His hair was dark and combed perfectly, but his face was drawn tight, as if he had been carrying something heavy for so long he had forgotten how to set it down. In his lap, the roses rested like a promise he couldn't bring himself to deliver. Lily shifted her school bag higher on her shoulder and stood for a moment, just watching him. She thought he might look up and see her, but he didn't. The cars passed by on the street behind them, but it felt like a quiet bubble surrounded the bus stop where only the two of them existed for a little while. Lily knew her mother would tell her not to bother strangers, especially ones who looked so serious. But she couldn't stop thinking that if she were sitting there all alone and sad, she would hope someone would ask if she was okay. So, she took a breath and stepped forward until she was close enough that her shadow fell across his shoes. He still didn't look up. She twisted her fingers together nervously, feeling her throat tighten. Finally, in the softest voice she had, she said, "Sir, why are you sad?" The question seemed to break whatever trance he had been in. His head lifted slowly, and she saw his eyes were the same bright blue as the sky behind him, though they were wet and tired. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, as if he were trying to decide whether she was really there or just something he had imagined. Lily felt her heart beat faster. She almost wished she hadn't asked because the sadness in his face was so deep it made her want to cry, too. But she stood very still, waiting, because something told her this was important. She didn't know that with that single question, she had already changed everything that would happen next. The man didn't answer right away. He looked at Lily with such an unreadable expression that she almost took a step back, but then something softened in his eyes, something that made her feel he wasn't angry she had spoken. She watched as he swallowed once, like he was trying to make his voice work again after a long silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and husky, as if the words were coming up from somewhere deep inside that hurt to touch. He said, "My daughter, she died 5 years ago." He didn't look away from her when he said it, and Lily felt the air go strange and heavy, the way it did when the sky turned dark before a storm. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. Her mother had always told her that death was something sad but natural, something that happened to everyone eventually, but she had never been so close to someone who had lost their child. She tried to imagine how it would feel if her own mother disappeared and never came back. And the thought made her throat sting with tears. She could see that the man was trying to hold himself very still, as if he thought moving might let all the sadness spill out where he couldn't gather it up again. Lily shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The cars kept passing behind them, and she could hear the hiss of tires against the road and the faint honk of a horn far away. But the man didn't seem to hear anything at all. It was as if he was sitting inside a quiet place she couldn't see. And she realized that he might have been sitting in that place for years. She looked at the roses again, bright and red and too beautiful to belong in this moment. She wondered if he brought them every year, if this was his way of saying he hadn't forgotten, that he was still her father even if she wasn't here to see him. That thought made her chest ache, and before she could stop herself, she felt warm tears sliding down her cheeks. The man blinked when he saw her crying, his eyebrows drawing together in confusion. For the first time, he looked less like someone trapped in his own sadness and more like a father. Worried he had upset her, he shifted on the bench, adjusting the flowers as if he didn't know what to do with his hands. Lily wiped her eyes on the back of her hand and shook her head quickly, trying to show she wasn't afraid of him. She thought about how her mother always said that sometimes people just needed someone to sit beside them so they wouldn't have to be alone with their pain. Her voice shook when she spoke, but she didn't care. She asked, Do you miss her every day?" The question seemed to surprise him. He let out a slow breath, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he nodded once and she saw that the simple motion cost him something. "Every day," he said softly, and his voice sounded like it had carried that weight a long time. She didn't know what to say to make that better. She didn't think any words could. So she took another small step closer. Close enough that she could see how tired he was. And she asked the only thing her heart could think of, Can I give you a hug?" For a second, she worried he would say no, that he would be too grown up and proud to accept comfort from a child. But he didn't. His eyes closed briefly, like he was studying himself, and when he opened them again, they looked a little less empty. He nodded, almost too faint for her to see. Lily felt her own tears start again, but this time they didn't scare her. She set down her school bag and carefully stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. His suit was cool and smooth under her cheek, and she felt him go very still before his hand came up to rest lightly on her back. She thought maybe he hadn't been hugged in a long time. Maybe he had forgotten what it felt like to be held. She stayed there without moving, feeling his breathing grow steadier. And for the first time since she saw him, she felt something in the air begin to loosen. It wasn't happiness, but it was something like hope. For a while, neither of them said anything. Lily kept her arms around the man's shoulders and felt the slow, uneven way he was breathing, as if he were trying to remember how to do it without pain. She could feel the warmth of his hand resting lightly against her back. And though he barely moved, she sensed he was holding on to her presence the way someone might hold on to a rope in deep water. She thought it was strange how a grown-up who looked so important and sure of himself could feel as lost as any child. It made her realize that being sad didn't care how big you were or how much money you had. Sadness could find anyone, and sometimes all you could do was let it be seen. After a moment, she loosened her hold and stepped back just enough that she could see his face again. His eyes were still bright with tears, but his shoulders didn't look so tense anymore. He looked at her as if he was trying to find words that wouldn't sound too heavy for her to hear, but she didn't mind the heaviness. She thought that maybe it was better to be honest than to pretend nothing hurt. She sat down on the bench next to him, folding her legs under her yellow dress so they wouldn't swing, and looked at the roses in his hands. Up close, they were even more beautiful, their petals deep red and velvety. She reached out a fingertip and touched the edge of one blossom, and then she asked softly, "Are those her favorite?" The man nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the flowers as if he were remembering something far away. "She used to pick red roses for her mother's birthday," he said in a voice that sounded like he was speaking more to the memory than to her. "And when she was little, she liked to pretend they were magic." Lily tried to picture the girl he was talking about, a girl who must have looked a little like her, small and bright and certain the world had secret wonders. She thought it was a nice way to remember someone by bringing the things they had loved back into the world for a day. She folded her hands in her lap, feeling her throat ache again. "What was her name?" she asked carefully. He swallowed and looked at her, and even though his face was lined with sadness, she thought he looked a little lighter for having spoken about his daughter. "Her name was Anna," he said. Lily repeated it softly to herself, as if she were making a promise not to forget. She didn't know why it felt important, but she thought maybe a person stayed alive a little bit as long as someone else remembered their name. She looked down at the ground, feeling a single tear slide off her cheek and fall onto the concrete. She didn't wipe it away. It didn't feel right to pretend she wasn't sad for him. The man seemed to notice because he shifted the roses to one arm and reached out a hand to brush the tear gently from her cheek. It was such a careful, fatherly gesture that she felt something warm break open in her chest. "I didn't mean to make you cry," he said quietly. But she shook her head. "It's okay," she whispered. "Sometimes people need someone to cry with them." He looked at her for a long moment, his blue eyes full of something she didn't have a name for. And then he nodded. It was a small motion, but it felt like the beginning of something. She didn't know what it would be, but she thought maybe he didn't feel quite so alone now. They sat like that, side by side, while the evening shadows grew longer around them. Lily thought that even though nothing could bring Anna back, maybe there were other ways to help someone feel less empty. She didn't have any big ideas or special words. All she had was her own small heart beating fast and true beside his. And for some reason, that felt like enough. The air grew cooler as the shadows stretched across the pavement, and Lily pulled her knees up under her chin, resting her cheek on top of them. She watched the man hold the roses carefully, as if they might break if he gripped them too hard. She wondered how many times he had sat here on this same bench, in this same quiet with those same flowers in his hands. She thought, it must take a lot of love to keep coming back every year, even when it hurt. She didn't know much about grief, but she knew it was something that could make people feel like they were locked in a room no one else could see. Maybe that was why her own heart felt tight, just sitting beside him. Even though she had never met Anna, Lily felt like she could almost imagine her, a girl with bright eyes and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, running around picking roses as if she really believed they held magic. The man's eyes were far away again, and Lily knew he was remembering something he didn't want to let go of. She wondered if he thought that talking about Anna would make the memories fade, like they were something too fragile to share. She wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that memories were stronger when you let someone else hold them for a little while. But she didn't know how to say it without sounding like a child who didn't understand anything. So instead, she rested her hand gently on his arm, the way her mother did when Lily was sick or scared. His gaze returned to her and she thought she saw a flicker of surprise there, as if he wasn't used to someone staying this long to listen. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't have to. She felt it in the way he didn't pull away. She took a slow breath and looked down at her shoes, scuffed and dusty from her walk home. Then she asked in the smallest voice she could manage, did she know you loved her? The question seemed to echo in the space between them, louder than she had expected. He looked down at the roses, and for a moment she thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and quiet. I told her every day, he said. But after she was gone, I kept thinking of all the times I was too busy, all the times I thought there would be more time. Lily didn't know what to say to that because it sounded like the saddest truth she'd ever heard. She thought of all the afternoons her own mother had come home too tired to talk, all the days Lily had wished she would stay a little longer before leaving for work again. She thought maybe grown-ups didn't always realize how much their children noticed, how much they held on to the little signs of love that were easy to overlook. She turned her face up to look at him, blinking back tears, and said, I think she knew. Her voice was steady in a way she hadn't expected, as if it came from somewhere older and braver than she felt. Because you're still here, you still bring her flowers. You still talk about her. That means she was really, really loved. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were wet, but softer. She could tell he was trying not to cry in front of her, but she thought it would have been okay if he did. Sometimes tears were the only way to say the things your voice couldn't. A breeze lifted the ends of her braids and stirred the petals of the roses. She watched as one loose petal fluttered to the ground, landing on the pavement between their feet. She thought it looked a little like a tiny heart, and she almost picked it up to keep, but something made her leave it there. Maybe it was supposed to stay in that place as a small sign that even when something fell, it could still be beautiful. She didn't know how much longer they sat like that, the man with his roses and her with her hands folded in her lap. But she knew she didn't want to leave until he felt strong enough to stand. She thought that maybe, just maybe, being there with him was more important than anything else she could have done that day. After a long stretch of quiet, the man adjusted his grip on the bouquet, and Lily could tell he was gathering the courage to say something he hadn't let himself admit out loud before. His fingers trembled a little where they pressed against the cellophane wrapping. And when he finally looked at her, it was like he was letting her see a piece of his heart he usually kept hidden. His voice came out low and a little shaky as he said, you know, it's been 5 years, but some mornings I still wake up and expect her to be here. It feels like my mind forgets just long enough for me to believe she's in the next room reading or drawing or waiting for me to notice her. He swallowed hard and Lily watched as his throat worked, the effort it cost him not to let himself break down completely. Then I remember, he went on, and it feels like losing her all over again." He stopped speaking and the last of the daylight slipped away, leaving only the yellow glow of the street lamp overhead. The light fell across his face and Lily thought he looked both older and somehow softer than he had before. She shifted a little closer on the bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Even though she was small, she hoped he would feel less alone with someone beside him. Her mother always said that grief could make people build walls around themselves without meaning to. But Lily believed even the tallest wall could have a door if someone cared enough to knock. She rested her chin on her knees and spoke without really thinking, the words spilling out because she didn't want him to sit in that ache alone. "I think she'd be happy you remember her," she said gently. "I think she'd love that you still bring her flowers and think about her so much." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the petals again, his expression almost bewildered, as if he hadn't ever let himself wonder what his daughter might feel about all these yearly visits. "You really think so?" he asked after a moment, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. Lily nodded, her braids brushing her cheeks. "I do," she said. "Because when you love someone that big, it doesn't stop just because they can't be here. It's still there all the time. Maybe she can feel it wherever she is." She had no way to be sure it was true, but in that moment, she believed it with her whole heart. The man let out a breath that sounded almost like a sigh and almost like a laugh. He looked at her and something in his gaze shifted. He didn't look so hollow now. Instead, there was a kind of wonder, like he hadn't known how much he'd needed someone to say those words out loud. "What's your name?" he asked, and his voice was steadier than it had been all evening. "Lily," she said, and she managed a small, shy smile. "And you?" He hesitated, then said, "Michael." She repeated it softly to herself, thinking it was important that she remember. He shifted the roses to one side and surprised her by holding out his hand. She looked at it for a second before she slipped her own into his, and his palm was warm and a little rough, like her grandfather's had been. She realized it felt comforting, a reminder that even the saddest people could still be touched. They sat like that for a little while, their hands resting between them, and Lily thought that maybe the reason she had stopped at the bus stop wasn't an accident at all. Maybe some moments happened because they were supposed to. She didn't know what would happen when he finally stood up and walked away, but she knew he wouldn't be the same. Neither would she. In that quiet, she felt something gentle settle around them. A kind of peace that didn't erase the sadness, but made it easier to carry. And for the first time since she had seen him, she believed he might be able to get up and take the next step forward. Lily didn't know exactly how much time passed while she and Michael sat there with their hands resting quietly between them, but the longer she stayed, the more she felt something in the air change. The sharp heaviness she'd felt at first had softened into something slower and more bearable, like the way her chest stopped hurting so much after she'd cried all she could. She thought maybe that was what healing started to feel like. Not something sudden or bright, but more like the gentle return of air to a room that had been closed too long. Every now and then, Michael's thumb moved a little where it rested against her knuckles. And even though he didn't say anything, she understood he was grateful in a way bigger than words. She was grateful, too. She felt like her heart had stretched wider just by sitting here and listening to him talk about Anna. She had never thought before about how much it mattered to share stories of the people you loved, even after they were gone. She wondered if someday she would be brave enough to do the same. After a while, Michael shifted on the bench and looked down at the roses again. In the street lamp's glow, they seemed almost to shine, each petal perfect and fragile in its own way. He drew in a slow breath like he was trying to steady himself. And then he looked over at her with an expression that made her chest ache all over again. It wasn't the same lost sadness he'd had when she first saw him sitting there. It was something more tender and full of ache, but also of a quiet acceptance. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that if I came here every year, if I kept doing all the little rituals, maybe it would feel less like she was slipping away." His voice cracked just a little, but he kept going. "But every time I sat here alone, it felt like I was trying to hold on to something that was already disappearing." He swallowed hard and glanced down as if embarrassed by how much he was sharing. "It never occurred to me that maybe I wasn't supposed to do it by myself." Lily wanted to tell him that no one should have to grieve alone, that even the bravest grown-ups needed other people sometimes, but she couldn't find the right sentence that would hold all of that. So instead, she scooted even closer until her shoulder touched his arm, and she nodded slowly. She thought maybe he could feel what she meant without her having to say it. When he met her gaze again, his eyes were shining, but there was a new steadiness there that hadn't been before. She could see that he was beginning to understand that remembering someone didn't have to be a solitary punishment, that it could also be something shared, and she was proud, in a quiet way, to have helped him see it. Michael cleared his throat and looked out at the street where a bus rumbled by without stopping. He shifted the bouquet in his hands, turning it so a few petals brushed against the back of Lily's wrist. She watched them move and felt a little thrill of wonder that something so delicate could survive being held all this time. "I don't know if it makes sense," he said after a moment, "but sitting here with you feels more like a way to honor her than all the years I sat here alone." His voice sounded steadier, and when he looked at her, she thought he was finally seeing her not just as a kind child, but as someone who mattered, someone whose presence was real and important. She didn't know what to say to that, so she only smiled and rested her free hand over the roses for a moment, feeling the cool petals under her palm. The silence that followed was the first one that didn't feel heavy. It felt like a pause in the middle of something important, the kind of pause her mother took when she needed to find her next breath after saying something true. For the first time since she'd sat down, Lily believed he would be okay when he finally stood up. Not because the sadness would leave him, but because it wouldn't own every part of him anymore. She thought that maybe grief was a little like those roses, beautiful and painful at the same time, something you could carry, but didn't always have to hold alone. Sitting there with Michael, she realized she had learned something she would never forget, something she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Lily felt the last traces of daylight fade until the street lamp was the only thing casting its soft glow over them. She could see the way the light turned the edges of Michael's dark hair almost silver and made the red roses look deeper and more vivid against his blue suit. It was strange to think she had been walking home only an hour ago without any idea that she would stop here or that this evening would become something she would remember forever. She watched him shift the flowers again, his thumb brushing lightly over a petal. And she thought about how many stories must be woven into that single gesture, every birthday, every missed chance to say something, every moment he had replayed over and over in his mind until it became almost too much to hold. She wondered if adults knew how much children noticed. She wondered if her own mother realized she could see when she was sad, even when she tried to hide it behind tired smiles. Michael seemed to be thinking the same thing because after a while he took a slow breath and said, "You remind me of her a little." His voice didn't shake this time, though it was soft enough that Lily had to be very still to hear it clearly. She felt her heart squeeze in a way that was almost painful, not because she was upset, but because it felt like the most important thing anyone had ever told her. She tucked her chin against her knees and whispered, was she shy, too? She wasn't sure why she asked, but it felt like the right question. He looked at the ground for a moment, then lifted his eyes with a small, almost wistful smile. "No," he said. "She was brave in ways I couldn't understand sometimes. She always wanted to help people, even strangers, even me." He paused and she thought maybe he was remembering some small moment that had never left him. The way she remembered the time her mother had stayed up all night when Lily had the flu, even though she had to work the next morning. It struck her then that love was really just a collection of all the small ways you showed up, all the little choices you made to be there for someone else. She had never thought of it that way before, but sitting here with Michael, she was sure it was true. She rested her cheek against her knees again and closed her eyes, imagining a girl with bright eyes and a voice that never hesitated. A girl who had believed in magic and roses and maybe even in the idea that her father would never stop loving her. When she opened her eyes, Michael was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. It was sad, but there was something else, too. Something like relief. He looked down at the roses again, and then he said in a voice that was more certain than anything he had said before, "I think you're right. She would be happy I'm here." He didn't say it like a question this time. He said it like something he finally believed. Lily didn't know how to answer, so she just reached out and touched his arm. She didn't need words. She thought maybe there were times when sitting close and being quiet together was better than any sentence she could have found. After a while, she felt the first hint of evening chill creep into the air, and she knew her mother would be wondering where she was. She shifted, thinking she should probably start home, but she didn't want to leave Michael if he still felt lost. Before she could say anything, he looked over and spoke in the soft, careful way grown-ups did when they wanted to be sure you would remember what they were saying. "Thank you for staying with me," he said. "I don't know if you understand how much it meant." She looked at him, feeling her own throat go tight again, and nodded. She thought she did understand, at least a little. She knew what it felt like to be alone and then to have someone stay just because they cared. And she knew that even if she never saw Michael again, she would always remember this evening as the day she learned you didn't have to be big or important to help someone feel less alone. You only had to be willing to sit beside them and listen. Lily shifted a little on the bench, feeling the cool metal beneath her legs and the quiet that had settled so completely around them. It didn't feel like the kind of quiet that made her anxious, the kind that felt empty and too big. This was a softer quiet, the kind that happened when there was nothing left to say, because everything important had already been shared. She could see that Michael was breathing more evenly now, as if the simple fact of not being alone had steadied something inside him that had been trembling for too long. She watched him look down at the roses in his lap. And she wondered if he was remembering the first time he had ever bought them, maybe when Anna was still here to smile and take them from his hands. She hoped that was the memory he was holding on to right now, because it seemed gentler than the sorrow that had weighed him down before. She folded her hands together in her lap and studied the way the petals looked under the street lamp's glow, like small pieces of captured light. For a little while, neither of them moved. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of rain, even though the sky was still clear. Lily knew she should go home soon, her mother would be worried, and she didn't want to make her afraid. But she also felt that leaving too quickly would be like letting go of something that wasn't ready to end. She thought about all the afternoon she had hurried past people without stopping to notice them. All the times she'd seen sadness in a grown-up's eyes and looked away because she didn't know what to do. Sitting here beside Michael made her feel braver, as if she'd learned something about how important it was to reach out anyway, even when you were small and didn't have any special answers to give. When she finally shifted to pick up her school bag, Michael lifted his head and looked at her with an expression she thought she might remember forever. It wasn't exactly a smile, but it was softer than any look he'd given her all evening, and his eyes weren't as tired as they had been. He set the roses carefully on the bench beside him and reached into his coat pocket. For a moment, she wondered if he would hand her money or some polite gift, because that was what adults thought they were supposed to do. But instead, he took out a small worn leather card holder. He opened it and slipped out a business card with his name printed in neat letters. When he held it out to her, she hesitated, not sure why he wanted her to have it. But then he spoke in the same calm, warm voice he'd used when he thanked her. "If you ever need anything," he said, "or if you just want to talk, you can call this number." His hand didn't shake as he held the card, and she thought maybe that was proof he was stronger now than when she first walked up. She took the card carefully, holding it as though it were something precious, and tucked it into the small zippered pocket of her backpack. She wanted to say something more, something that would explain how much this moment had mattered to her, too. But the words felt too big for her mouth. So instead, she simply nodded. And when she met his eyes again, she knew he understood. She stood up slowly, brushing the wrinkles from her yellow dress, and looked down at him one last time. He didn't look like a stranger anymore. He looked like someone who had shared something sacred with her, even if no one else would ever understand what it was. She lifted her hand in a small wave, and this time he smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached all the way to his eyes. As she turned and started the walk home, she felt the weight of the evening settle gently across her shoulders, not heavy like sadness, but comforting, like a blanket she could wrap around herself when she needed to remember what kindness felt like. She thought about how her mother would probably scold her a little for being late, and how she would listen patiently before she tried to explain that she hadn't been wasting time. She had been learning how sometimes the smallest people could make the biggest difference, and she knew she would keep that lesson with her, folded safe in her heart, the same way she tucked Michael's card into her bag. When she looked over her shoulder one last time, she saw him standing beside the bench, the roses cradled in his arms. For the first time all evening, he looked ready to leave, and she understood that was because he didn't feel alone anymore. She walked the rest of the way home with her head held high, feeling certain she had done exactly what she was meant to do, and that maybe, just maybe, her kindness would stay with him for the rest of his life. I think this ending is quietly powerful because it doesn't rely on anything grand or dramatic to feel meaningful. Instead, it shows how something as small as a child's compassion can shift the entire weight of someone's grief. What I love most is that it doesn't pretend Michael's sadness is gone. It simply isn't crushing him anymore because Lily chose to see him, to sit beside him without expecting anything in return. This story feels honest about loss and hopeful about human connection at the same time. It reminds us that the most ordinary moments, a question, an offered hand, a willingness to stay, can become the moments that change people's lives in ways neither person could have imagined. To me, the ending proves that healing doesn't always look like closure. Sometimes it looks like two strangers parting with the knowledge that they were a little less alone, even if just for one evening. And that, in its own quiet way, feels like the most beautiful kind of happy ending, brought to you by Millionaire in Love.